and then we'll be off and running.
Okay, good. So, hi, welcome. I'd like to introduce Yiga Samuel, who I'm really excited about what she's going to talk about today. She is an open source guru from the Chaos organization. And she actually submitted a talk for our open source conference. And we decided we weren't going to do remote talks, but her talk was amazing. Everybody in the program committee wanted to pick it, but we just decided not to do virtual for reasons, whatever. I actually voted it. I was like, no, do it anyway. I was overrode.
You're the one who doesn't have to do all the work of it.
That's okay. Anyway, I'm excited that she's going to offer to present here to the GW coders, and I think she's got some really interesting stuff to say, and I think maybe we can have a little discussion during or afterwards as well, because there's some fun topics that she discusses. So take it away, Yiga. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, David. That was a beautiful introduction. Thank you for all the work you do. And I'm super happy, excited to be here, right? The most important thing is that we're sharing knowledge and learning from each other. And thank you so much, Ryan, and everyone in the back end for having me. So the topic of today's talk is open source for local problems and building bridges between local needs and global tech. I don't know, David, can you please share your screen for me?
Do you want me to? Do you want to share yours, or do you want one of us to share?
I think yours will be better, just in case my internet is iffy.
Okay.
All right, Ryan's gonna.
I can do it. I have it.
Thank you. Sorry for the trouble. Okay.
Second. There we go.
Yes. Okay, awesome. So I'll just start by introducing, so the term global is actually a combination of global and local, right? So one of the biggest challenges we face different challenges today, including climate change, public health crisis, governance failures. They're all global in nature, but they affect, different regions differently, right? So for example, climate change causes flooding in Bangladesh, but wildfires in California. Public health crises like COVID-19 hits urban and rural areas very differently. And then I think one of the interesting things is that governance issues like corruption and lack of transparency, just impacts communities in diverse ways. And I believe as an open source advocate that this is where open source technology steps in, because it gives the communities the power to develop their own solutions tailored to their local needs. It enables communities to cooperate globally while sharing knowledge and innovations, and then scale successful solutions so that they benefit other regions with similar challenges. So essentially this talk will cover three local problems three local problems, yes, across three sectors, right? So I'll be focusing on climate adaptation, public health, and governance and civic tech. And I'll try my best with the little time that I have to include real-world case studies of open source projects that are making amazing impact. Right, so sector one, if we can please go to the next slide. So sector one, one thing is that this slide is it's a summary, but I'll try my best. So sector one is open source and climate adaptation. And the challenge here is that climate change impacts are unequal. Like I said earlier, there's flooding in Indonesia and Bangladesh, which is displacing millions. There's desertification in Africa, which is causing food insecurity. There's hurricane and typhoons in the Caribbean and Southeast Asia, which require rapid disaster response. So there are various open source tools that help by providing accurate climate data, predicting disasters, and enabling local adaptation strategies. So, and I noted various open source solutions which are in action. One of them is open source StreetMap and humanitarian OpenStreetMap team. What do? They're an open source team that's created by volunteers, obviously, that prepare for and respond to disasters, right? And it's been used in Nepal during the Nepal earthquake in 2015. Volunteers mapped affected areas in real time to help relief teams. So that brings their work, their global work, to a local problem, right? And then for the Mozambique cyclone Idai in 2019, it was also used to track the flooding and direct aid where it was needed the most. I'm just going to drop their GitHub repo. Let me quickly drop it in the chat. Okay, so give me 1 second. I need to be sure. Okay, I think I just got the name in the chat. Sorry about that. Just so everyone can follow along, and if you want to check them out. There's also Open Climate Fix. They use open source machine learning models to predict solar energy production and optimize energy grids. What does this help do? It helps regions transition to cleaner, renewable energy sources and reduces reliance on fossil fuels. And I think that's amazing because I'm also a climate advocate. The interesting fact is I picked these topics because they're topics I'm passionate about, or sectors rather. So it's really amazing to see that from wherever they are in the world, they're also doing amazing stuff and using their code, their learnings to impact communities locally. And I'll also share Open Climate Fix's link quickly in the chat. Okay, so that's Open Climate's GitHub. And we have Open AQ. So AQ stands for air quality. So it's literally open air quality data. What they do at Open Air Quality Data is aggregating the global air pollution data, and they make it freely available because, of course, it's open source. And this helps policymakers and communities take action on air pollution. It's been used in India by environmental activists to push for stricter pollution regulations, which I think is amazing, by the way. It's also been used in Mongolia to help track quality in Ulaanbaatar, one of the most polluted cities in the world, sorry. I also think that's amazing. Now I'll go to sector 2, which is open source and public health. I think one of the challenges with public health is the fact that I think around the world, there's unequal access to healthcare wherever you go to. So you see rural areas lack access to doctors and hospitals, especially in the global south. I don't know what it's like in the US, but in the global south, you have rural areas lacking access to doctors and hospitals, and medical software, when there is, right, is expensive and locked behind proprietary systems. Data sharing, which is very critical in pandemics, is they're oftentimes fragmented, right, because of the health systems that they use. So I've shared the problem, and right now I'm going to share open source solutions in action. We have the District Health Information System 2, the DHIS2, which is an open source health data system used by over 70 countries to track disease outbreaks and manage public health data. I'm so proud of open source. And it's been used in Sierra Leone and Liberia. Yes, it's been used in Sierra Leone and Liberia to track, I don't know if anybody remembers the Ebola outbreak that happened sometime in the global south. It was used to track Ebola cases and manage response efforts. In India, it has been used to help manage vaccination programs and track child health. So I'm just going to drop their amazing repo right in the chat. Their GitHub link right in the chat. And one of the things I took away from this, while preparing for this talk is the fact that, when you're preparing or when you're doing your work, wherever you are, we should always think of the problems sometimes are not there, right? In the terms of, where would it be used? Where can it be used, right? It might not be visible right now, but if you have an idea and you think, this might make life easier, then it's always amazing when it goes the open source way, because then there's more access for everyone. That's just by the way. So we have GNU Health. GNU Health is basically an open source electronic medical record, EMR. They're called EMRs. And it's a system, EMRs are system used in low resource hospitals. And the impact of that is that it helps rural clinics digitize patient records without costly proprietary software. And then it also helps telemedicine initiatives in Latin America and Africa. GNU Health is hosted on Codeberg. They've won a lot of awards. I can't even count the number of awards that they've won, and they're a little bit popular. But this, I've shared their repository link where they were using essentially the HIS, which you would find the GNU, the EMR systems in. And then we also have the open source malaria.
Oops.
System, which uses open data and AI to predict malaria outbreaks. In the global south, because it's mosquitoes, STEM that predicts malaria outbreaks is, very, very important and very useful. It helps the health officials take preventive actions before outbreak happens. The third is on governance. There's around the world, most of the world, there's a lack of transparency and citizen engagement. So you find out that citizens sometimes are not actively involved in the way that the government takes their decisions or makes decisions for them, right? So many governments struggle with corruption, limited accountability, and of course, weak citizen participation.
Hey, Yiga, your connection is pretty bad right now. Do you want to try
And
calling?
when government officials, can you hear me? Yes, please. Oh,
You're
okay.
breaking up
Can
quite
you
a
hear me
bit.
now?
Yeah, it's off and on.
Oh,
but
wow.
I'm thinking maybe you could call back in. Would it be possible? Does
Is there
Okay,
Nigerian
let me
number
try
on
calling in
this?
then. I'm so sorry about that.
No, that's okay. We understand. It's you're
Is
a
it better
world away.
now?
Maybe what do you think? Should we keep going?
Yes.
Yeah, maybe we'll turn off the video and maybe that will help. All right, try again.
That actually made it worse.
Yeah.
Are you still there?
Just trying to dial
He looks frozen.
Yeah.
How would she dial it?
Well, they have a whole list of numbers on the invite, but I've never paid attention to are any of those international. I assume some, but I don't know if there's a Nigerian.
Okay. Is it better?
We can hear you at the moment.
Okay, maybe I should just keep talking. Is it? Oh, okay, so let me try calling in. Oh, yes, I'm still here.
They'll see a Nigeria number on Zoom. They have Japan,
All right.
Canada,
Oh, she dropped off.
Brazil.
Well, this is why I put the slides forward.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
So sorry.
No worries. Not your fault. Why don't we just keep
Hello?
going and see how it goes?
Okay, awesome. So I was about getting into open source and governance. The challenge of that, I covered that as well. With governments, many governments around the world struggling with corruption, limited accountability, and weak citizen participation. And a few open source solutions in action actually are Ushahidi. Ushahidi crowdsources crisis response, election monitoring, and human rights violations. They've been used in Kenya to track election violence in 2008. They've been used in 2010 to track the Haiti earthquake, to help coordinate disaster and relief efforts. Let me quickly copy their GitHub link and put it in the chat for everyone. Open data portals provide open data sets for civic tech organizations, civic tech projects, policy research, and anti-corruption efforts. The impacts have been seen in Africa and the European Union. So an example is OpenGov Africa. They leverage open data to empower citizens, track government activities, and ensure that public officials are actually accountable for their actions. The CCAN as well has been used by the European Union to power open data initiatives that support public services and transparency. Quickly going to also copy both GitHub profiles and share them with us. Please, can you hear me? I just want to make sure I'm not talking to myself.
Yeah, that was great.
Okay, awesome. Okay, perfect. And I think after covering these sectors, I believe that expanding the conversation will help, because we also want to understand how different people, how open source contributors, OSPOs, and organizations can actually make a difference. Because I think that beyond technical solutions, open source is ultimately about the people, the developers, the contributors, the maintainers, researchers, activists, and organizations who collaborate to make meaningful impact. But the question is, how do we ensure that open source solutions for global problems are truly effective, inclusive, and sustainable? And I tried to break it down. So firstly, the role of individuals, how open source contributors, I believe, can make a difference. I believe we can move beyond the code. And I also think that while the code is super important, we've come to a point where we also need to tie in the different parts. So for example, for open source to successfully address real world problems, we're going to be needing researchers who can analyze this data and ensure that decisions that are being made at a high level, at the local level, they're based on evidence, actual facts. We also need designers and UX experts who can create accessible and user-friendly interface, because a tool that is very hard or too hard to use won't be adopted. And as someone who is an advocate as well for accessibility and people living with disabilities, I believe that the tech, when we're designing for people, we should think about everyone as well. And I also believe that community organizers and advocates who can connect with the grassroots, the local needs, are very important to these global solutions that we need to push for adoption. And of course, technical writers, because technical writers need to create documentation, tutorials, and case studies for others to learn and contribute. And when talking about technical writers or documentation, I'm not just thinking the regular technical writer. So for example, you are going to, your product or your solution is going to be used in Asia, and there's a problem in Asia. Can a contributor translate everything in documentation to the Chinese language or to the Mandarin language, for example? So that's where I'm thinking from. And I think that it's also important if we can factor those things in so that they can really reach the grassroots, right? So an example of this is Ushadidi, which started, as a tech project, but their real success came from journalists, activists, and volunteers who helped it evolve into a critical tool for crisis response. Another example as well is, me contributing to the Opia Foundation and translating or coordinating a group to translate the lessons into Nigerian Pidgin and onboarding that version onto the app. So that means that children in Africa can take lessons, math lessons in Nigerian Pidgin directly on the app. So that's an example of the role that different kinds of individuals can make in open source solutions. And that way we bridge the gap between local needs and global tech, right? I like to give one last example, actually. OpenStreetMap is successful because of local mappers. If you remember when I gave the example of humanitarian OpenStreetMap, I talked about different local mappers who took ownership of their regions, right? Rather than outsiders mapping the communities, because of course, the outsiders will not exactly understand how the community functions. So in the situation where there's a disaster in real time, the locals are the ones, that understand that. And here, I would also say that many open source projects suffer from burnout because maintainers are mostly underpaid or working for free. So I believe that contributors can advocate for ethical sponsorship models. For example, Open Collective that we already have and GitHub sponsors, institutional support from governments, NGOs, and university, and better recognition, better adoption of open source contributions, even in personal professional spaces. The second way I think that we can do this is the role of open source program offices, OSPOs, driving systemic change. Yes, of course. Like the George Washington University, and they're doing an amazing job, by the way. So universities and governments, companies have started OSPOs to coordinate open source strategy and collaboration. But one of the questions I ask is, how can OSPOs ensure that open source is actually addressing global problems? And I think one of the issues here I see, and correct me if I'm wrong, is bridging the research and real world impacts, right? So while universities are a hub of research, sometimes most of it stays locked behind paywalls because of different things. But I believe OSPOs can promote open access to research that contributes to solving real world issues, and then encourage students and researchers to contribute to open source, civic tech, climate science, anything that they really feel like will be a public good or something that can be used in real time in the real world. And another way to do this is support community partnerships. So research doesn't just stay in academia, but it actually gets applied in real world settings. And the Open Data Institute has also worked with some universities to create open source climate and public health models that government now use in decision making. And I think that's a very, very great example. I can move beyond just using open source, because most companies use open source software, but they don't actively contribute. So I would encourage corporate contributions, that are critical, corporate contributions that I think can be good, or how do I put this now? I would say that corporate OSPOs should encourage, yes, that's the way I would put it. Corporate OSPOs should encourage corporate contributions to critical open source public goods, not just projects that benefit the companies. Yes, and ensure corporate funded open source projects to remain community driven rather than being abandoned when a company's priority shifts. The other area of concern as well would be that I would encourage OSPOs, corporate OSPOs specifically, to fund projects that address real world problems. So an example is Google, Microsoft, and IBM, who, as corporate OSPOs, who contribute to Linux and Kubernetes. But my question today is, what if more corporate OSPOs invested in public interest open source projects, right? And then the other OSPO group I would like to talk about is government OSPOs. For the government, I believe that governments around the world are major software buyers, but they often choose closed, expensive systems instead of supporting open source civic tech. I believe OSPOs in governments can mandate the use of open source software in public services, making government tech more transparent and cost effective. They can also fund open source projects that benefit citizens directly, like OpenGov Africa, and e-governance platforms, and open healthcare tools as well. Another way to make this better will be for government OSPOs to collaborate with open source communities, local open source communities, or global open source communities that are willing to, try building for the local community where the government is situated. And what does this do? It ensures that solutions are actually useful to the people who need them, right? So an example is Estonia, and they built an entire digital government infrastructure on open source software. And I think that's amazing. It's a great way to start. The third thing I'd like to say is the role of organizations, NGOs and nonprofits in amplifying open source for social good. Many humanitarian and nonprofit organizations need software but lack the budget for proprietary solutions. So organizations can support open source civic tech projects, ensuring tools for transparency. They can offer mentorship and resources. They can also fund open source training in underserved regions so that they can help more people become contributors. An example is the humanitarian OpenStreetMap team, which works with NGOs to map disaster-prone areas before crisis hits. And that was an example, that I gave earlier on the climate. Startups and entrepreneurs, what can they do? They can build ethical, open, and profitable solutions. Not every open source project has to be nonprofit. Open source business models are growing, and I believe that's great. So startups can also develop sustainable open source tools while offering paid services for those who need advanced features. And well, this example, I would say OpenAI, but then again, they started as open source nonprofit. So I don't think I like how that shifted, but I guess the question here is, how can we prevent essential AI tools from becoming closed and inaccessible? So I think the big question around open source is, when you start as, an open source nonprofit and then you become closed. However, it's also okay to start and let everybody know that you're an open source project, but hey, you're making profit down the line. I think that agrees with me, but yes. So, and then the last part of it is the challenges and the future of open source for local problems. I think some of the challenges in scaling open source solutions are data sovereignty. The question is always around who owns the data. Can local communities trust open platforms? There's always question about funding and sustainability, because many open source projects rely on volunteer contributors around the world. And really, how sustainable can that be? And also we have problems around, or challenges rather, as I'll call them, around digital literacy and access. Because if you're trying to go local as well, you would realize that many regions lack the technical expertise to adopt open source tools effectively. And hence why I I mentioned translating, thinking about technical writing beyond just writing in the top 3 languages of the world, right? So how about you make it really, really local if you do have contributors from that area? And my final thoughts will be the future of open source for global problems. I think that as we think about the future of open source in tackling both global and local, which are global challenges, there are many perspectives on what could help open source projects become more inclusive, impactful, and sustainable. Different people, contributors, maintainers, researchers, policymakers, and founders see the opportunities and roadblocks from their unique vantage points. So instead of really viewing this 1, 2, 3, 4 as a checklist of things that must happen, I think we should consider them as starting points for discussion. So there are different perspectives on what needs to change in open source. I think we can expand who can contribute. Some people believe open source needs more diverse contributors, not just developers from webs, but how open source needs better structures for local ownership so that solutions aren't imposed from the outside. That's a very interesting one. Another thing is, under expanding who can contribute, I also said before, what if we shifted our mindset to see designers, researchers, community leaders as essential open source contributors? That's one question. Another question is, how about expanding low-tech solutions for areas with limited internet access? So for example, how about making that app for places where, my internet connection just failed, literally. So for places like this, where internet connection can get really bad, how about making your solution downloadable one time on the app, on the Play Store, for example, on the App Store? How about making it a one-time download and, maybe a very minimal megabytes for people who don't have so much, in the global south, right? So I think those are things that we should think of when we're trying to expand who can contribute to open source, right? The other thing is long-term sustainability and maintainer support. Many maintainers say burnout is one of the biggest threats to open source sustainability. So could we build better funding models that don't rely solely on volunteer labor? That's a huge question. And so many others argue that sustainability isn't just about money. It's also about governance models that allow projects to survive beyond their original creators. I did hear a story around the open source space where somebody had ownership access and they deleted the whole organization or something like that, which is crazy. But how do we go around those things and ensure that governance models, we have accurate governance models that really work? The other question on the long-term sustainability is, how do we ensure open source tools serve the public good and get the same level of investment as commercial projects? I think that's very important. The third thing is strengthening local ownership and relevance. Some open source projects are really created, with good intentions, but they fail to engage more communities to building with them, right? The other question I have under this is that local developers and organizations often lack the resources to fully maintain open source solutions. So could global contributors play a better role in mentorship and collaboration? And my last question under the third thought is, should we rethink the way documentation and interfaces are designed? I talked about it earlier. So for people living with disabilities, so we make open source tools more accessible, not just to non-English speaking people, but for people living with disabilities and underrepresented communities, right? So that's number 3. The fourth point is public and private sector support. I think that a question here is, Governments and corporations heavily use open source software, but how often do they give back, right, to those softwares that they use? And some of the people in the public sector and private sector as well argue that corporate OSPOs should actively invest in public interest open source projects, not just internal tooling. And then my last question is, could academic OSPOs push for open access data and research tools, right? And aside from that, universities are already a hub of research, but how much of that research stays behind paywalls instead of being open to the world? And the next slide is, how can you get involved? So depending on your role or background, there are many ways to engage. And I listed a few to consider. If you're a developer or a data scientist, find an open source project that aligns with your skills and interests. I believe that contributing to not just code, but also bug reports, documentation, mentorship goes a long way. I believe working also on interoperability and accessibility will help so that these tools that you're creating with your time will and can be adopted or adopted globally. Yes. So for researchers and academics, yeah. So for researchers and academics, I believe that you can push for open access research and ensure that your work benefits the real world communities that you care about. You build open source models and tools that can be used beyond academia and make real impact in the world. You can also collaborate with civic tech, and climate tech initiatives that need data analysis and research reports for times when an earthquake happens, for example, for times when a community is suffering droughts, for example, right? For times when there's civic unrest. So you need data analysis to know what is going on, and in real time too. Community organizers and NGOs can partner with open source contributors to co-create solutions that meet local needs. Advocates for governments and nonprofit funding for open source and civic tech, open source civic and climate tech. They can also help bridge the gap between technical communities and grassroots movements. Students and faculty, I didn't forget you. So you can encourage your university's OSPOs. Of course, we have one here to support open source projects with real world impact. You can also contribute to open source, civic tech and governance tools. I've said that before. You can push for open source and open access learning materials in education. So not just open access, but the learning materials as well in education for you to, do better research. And then for companies and hospitals, you can invest in open source projects that serve the public good, not just corporate priorities. You can also support long-term maintainability, and this could be through funding, mentorship, or infrastructure support. Another way to do this is to ensure that your company isn't just a user, of open source tools, but they're actively contributing back, giving their quota, giving their intelligence, giving their time as well. So I think the last thing I would say, which is not on the slide, is that we all need to think about the role that we will play. There's no single roadmap for making open source more effective for solving local challenges. But I think that the most important takeaway is that open source isn't just about code, it's about the people. The people in the community, the open source community, the people in the real world community, the local community, and it's also about long-term sustainability. So while you might be an individual contributor, an organization, or part of a larger institution, I want to say to you that your involvement in open source shapes the future of how open source technology can impact communities worldwide. And like I always say, the future of global problem solving is open, it's transparent, and it's collaborative. One contribution at a time, we can all build it together. The question isn't just what does open source need, but what do you want to bring to the open source ecosystem? So let's talk about it. Thank you so much for taking your time to listen to my talk, regardless of my internet. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Yiga. It was really awesome to hear somebody halfway across the world having so many similar opinions to me. It's very comforting in this time right now. I really like that. I can tell you firsthand as an academic OSPO that one of our big challenges is having researchers work with the community and work to impact their local communities in a positive way. I feel like there's a little bit of a disconnect. And historically, I've been a software engineer, and I know that when I was writing code and talking to the users directly, I would build much better code. And researchers, I think, kind of like coders, often struggle to communicate a little bit, and then also feel uncomfortable going into communities. And communities aren't necessarily welcoming. They're not saying, hey, we need stuff. So it's kind of a two-way street. And yeah, that's a real problem that I don't know how to solve. But one of the things that we're doing here in our OSPO is really pushing forward on open science education. And I think the NASA has a really nice program called TOPS, which embodies a lot of the things that you're saying, and it really focuses on the impact, not necessarily just the citations and the papers, but doing research that's going to help the communities more directly, and focusing on that. So there's a lot of work involved in making that happen, but we're trying to do the work.
Thank you so much, Ryan. That was amazing. And I do think it's a two-way street. I agree. It's a two-way street, because sometimes as well, just like we said earlier on, some of these people going through these challenges might not even know that there can be certain kinds of technology that can help solve their problems, help make life better. From the perspective of being a global South, I would say that some of these communities are literally trying to make ends meet, right? So they push forward these problems that they think are not big problems, but they don't understand, but because they don't time and what it's causing, right? So for example, earlier last year in Nigeria, there was a heat wave. It was really, really hot. And all over TikTok, I could see people making videos and just saying, oh, it's so hot in Nigeria. Someone opened the gates of hell. Yeah, stuff like that. And it was just so interesting because I understood that it was climate change, but here they were, and they were literally very hot, but they were making fun of it. So in a sense, as a community, they don't even understand what is going on. They just don't understand. And then if you take it to them, there's also the problem of, I have bigger fish to fry. They think, and in their defense, really, that they have bigger fish to fry. So it's a big problem. I agree. It's not a one-way street. It's just what I'm trying to say. So thank you so much. Thank you.
Any other questions?
I didn't have any. Thought it was really good though. I think the expanding the community is an important. And how do you do that? Like, and we have students who do things that don't associate with coding at all. And how do you make it like the documentation part open to people who are good writers? And how do you get them involved to see that they can be part of it as well? That's not all. Hackathons are clearer. Like you can say, we are doing this event. There isn't like a create better documentation-a-thon. Where you get everyone together and you just work on documentation all weekend. Um,
Mhm,
so
mhm.
Maybe there should
So-
be.
maybe there should be.
Yes, and a way to answer that question as well is I volunteer, I contribute to OPIA Foundation, and at OPIA Foundation, I discovered this need as well, which was translating math lessons into Nigerian Pidgin. So in Nigeria, there are 774 local governments. So that's huge. First, 100 languages at least, right? And we have 3 major languages. But the one language that is common, or the one it's like English, but it's not English. So it's called way to communicate with people from different languages. So for example, they don't speak English, but they can understand Pidgin. So that's a way to cross the barrier if you don't speak English and if you don't speak their language as well. And so I saw this problem at OPIA, OPIA is in Africa as well. And I made a case, I have to make a case in that scenario to say, hey, why don't we translate math lessons into Nigerian Pidgin? So that way we break the barrier for children who can't understand English language, or maybe they just understand their dialect, but they understand Pidgin. Why don't we break that barrier to bring these math lessons to them? Because with maths, they can become anything tomorrow, right? And with that, I'm using myself as a case study. I had to, because I have this roots of, volunteering, contributing, doing SDG work. So I gathered up a team of people, right? Online and offline as well. And we worked on the translations, right? One after the other. So on the app, the way that the lessons are lesson 1. So for example, addition, right? So the difference, addition and subtraction, just like that, the way maths usually is. So each lesson, each topic, and each lesson just broken down. So I guess my answer to that question would be that if you can create the major documentation first, which is in English, figure out how you want to break it down, and then you have a contributor from the different regions, because you can't exactly access these people by yourself, right? So you have the different contributors from the different regions, and maybe put it on your website. I guess somebody would find it. And that's a good way to start. And then those people will put together the community and the people that understand the language and are willing to contribute. So I think that's a great start, if you ask me.
Yeah, one good way.
That's the question.
One good way along that is like maintainers and projects thinking about good first issues. And a good first issue could be to translate stuff. It doesn't have to be technical at all.
Yes. Yeah.
One
At
other.
all. It doesn't have to be technical. So that. Oh, sorry, David.
No, it's okay.
Please go ahead.
One other challenge that you highlighted this, and I'm just pointing it out, is the funding challenge. And like I'm fighting for my own funding, so I'm not able to fund other projects very much. We have student awards and we have other things where we try to incentivize, and we definitely do education. But the funding problem is real. And what keeps coming to my mind is some kind of a tax or a fee on the industry that's using open source for free and not giving back. But taxes and fees never go over well. So I don't know how to solve that problem.
And they're hard to enforce.
Yeah. So I just don't know how to solve that problem. I think I'm hopeful that governments can start playing a really big role in open source. I see that in France and in Germany and Kenya and some other countries. And so if they can start making the argument that you were making, that, hey, we're paying a lot for software, what if we made it ourselves and then we gave it not only to all of our government workers, but we also gave it to all of our citizens for free, but then we could tailor it to our, country size needs. Maybe that's in between global and local. That's like a global. I don't have the word yet.
Yes.
I'm
We don't have the
optimistic
word.
there.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm gonna go ahead and stop the
Yeah.
recording
Okay.
before I forget to.
Thank you, Yiga. That was great.